For 40 years I woke up most mornings carrying something heavy in my chest that I had no proper name for. Not grief exactly, not anger exactly, something in between. Something that had gone cold and hard the way bread does when you leave it out too long. I'm Margaret. I'm 87 years old, and the thing I carried was a story about my father that turned out not to be true. I need you to understand something before I tell you this. I was not a cruel person. I was not an unloving daughter. I was someone who saw something, understood it the only way I knew how at the time, and then built 40 years of distance on top of that understanding. 40 years of birthday cards that were polite but not warm. 40 years of Christmas dinners where I smiled at the right moments and felt nothing genuine behind the smile. 40 years of a relationship that looked, from the outside, like a normal father and daughter who simply were not particularly close. And that was the story I told myself too, that we were simply not close, that some fathers and daughters are just that way. I told myself that story so many times that it stopped feeling like a choice and started feeling like a fact. My father's name was Ronald. Everyone called him Ron. He was born in 1921 in a small town in Yorkshire, the second of 4 children, raised by a father who worked in the mills and a mother who, by all accounts, was a gentle and quietly exhausted woman. He came to America after the war. He met my mother in New York in 1951 at a dance that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend. She was from Virginia. He was from Yorkshire. They were both, I think, lonely in the particular way that people are lonely, and they have survived something enormous and are not sure what to do with the rest of their lives. They married in 1952. I was born in 1938. No, forgive me, I was born in 1938. That is not right either. I get turned around sometimes. I was born in 1938. My parents married in 1952, so let me correct myself. My mother was married before. My father came later. This is actually important to the story, so I want to be precise. My mother had been married briefly before the war to a man named Thomas, who died in the Pacific in 1943. I was Thomas's daughter. Ron came into my life when I was 14 years old, and he adopted me formally within 2 years of marrying my mother. I took his last name. I called him Dad. And for a time, for a long and genuinely beautiful time, I loved him without complication. He was not a demonstrative man. That is the honest thing to say about Ron. He did not hug freely. He did not say I love you the way people say it now, casually, at the end of phone calls and in text messages. But he was present. That is what I remember most about him from those early years. He was there. He came to my school plays. He drove me to university. He waited in the car outside without complaint while I took my driving test 3 times and failed it twice. He was not a man who spoke much, but he showed up, and at 14 and 15 and 16, showing up felt like more than enough. The moment that changed everything happened when I was 22. I had come home for a weekend from the city where I was working my first real job, and I walked into the house in the early afternoon, expecting it to be empty, because my mother had told me she was going to her sister's. I was wrong about the timing. I came through the back door into the kitchen, and I heard voices from my father's study. Not raised voices, quiet ones, the kind of quiet that feels deliberately kept low. I stopped walking. I stood in the kitchen holding my overnight bag, and I listened, and I heard my father talking to a woman who was not my mother. I want to be very careful about what I actually heard, because this is where everything matters. What I heard was my father's voice, low and serious and close. What I heard was a woman's voice responding. What I heard was my father say, and I can still hear it the way you can still hear it, certain things, no matter how old you get. He said, "She doesn't need to know." And the woman said something I could not fully make out, and my father said it would only hurt her. I put down my bag quietly. I went back out the door I had come in. I sat in the garden for an hour. Then I went back in through the front door, loudly announcing myself, and when I came into the hall, my father was alone in his study, and there was nobody else in the house. He looked up at me with a perfectly normal expression and said, "Margaret, I didn't know you were coming today." And I smiled and said, "Surprise," and neither of us said anything else about it. I never asked him. That is the thing that seems almost impossible to explain to people who are younger than me. In the world I grew up in the family I grew up in, you did not ask. You did not confront. You did not sit your father down and say, "Who was that woman? What are you keeping from my mother? What is happening in this house?" You absorbed what you saw. You made meaning out of it alone, in the dark, and then you lived with the meaning you made. And the meaning I made was this: my father was having an affair. My father was deceiving my mother. My father was not the man I thought he was. I never told my mother. That is the second thing that seems almost impossible to explain. But if you had known my mother, you might understand. She had already lost one husband. She was happy with Ron in the particular quiet way of someone who has learned not to expect too much from happiness. I was not going to be the one to Kai that from her. So I said nothing. And I slowly, over months and then years, began to pull back from him. Not dramatically. Not with accusations or scenes. Just a slow, steady withdrawal of the warmth I had given him freely since I was 14. He noticed. I know he noticed. He was not a man who spoke about such things. But I caught him looking at me sometimes across dinner tables with an expression I can only describe as confused and slightly wounded, and I felt nothing when I saw it, except a grim kind of justification. My mother died in 1978. Ron lived another 11 years after that. We continued, he and I, in our careful and slightly hollow way. I visited. I called. I was dutiful. On the surface we were fine, but I never gave him back what I had taken away, and I never explained why. And now I think about his last 11 years as a widower, in that house, with a daughter who was present, but not quite there. And it cost me something to think about it. It cost me a great deal. He died in 1989. He was 67 years old. A heart attack. Sudden. No warning. The way the men of his generation seemed to prefer to go, without a great deal of fuss. I flew to Yorkshire for the funeral because he had wanted to be buried near his own mother. I sat in a cold church with his remaining sister, a woman named Edith, who was then in her mid-70s, and after the service Edith held my hands in hers and said to me, "He was so proud of you. He talked about you all the time." And I smiled, and I thanked her, and I thought, that is what people say at funerals. The truth came to me 3 years later. 1992. I was clearing out some boxes I had taken from his house after he died and had never properly sorted through. Mostly old papers, bills, letters, the accumulated administrative sediment of a life. And in one of the boxes I found a small bundle of letters tied with kitchen string, and the return address on the envelopes was a name I did not know, a woman's name, and the postmarks ran from 1967 to 1972, right across the period I had spent building my silent case against him. I untied the string and I read. They were not love letters. They were not the letters of a man conducting an affair. They were the letters of a man corresponding with a woman named Dorothy, who was, as became clear by the third letter, my biological father's sister, Thomas's sister, the man who had died in the Pacific before I was old enough to remember him. Dorothy had found us somehow. I don't know exactly how, perhaps through a veterans organization, perhaps through my mother's family. She had reached out to Ron, and Ron had been writing to her, and he had been sending her photographs of me at school concerts, of me at graduation, of me on my wedding day. He had been quietly keeping Thomas's family connected to me, without telling my mother, because, and this is in his own handwriting, I can see it now in my mind, because he wrote to Dorothy in one of those letters, I don't want Margaret to feel divided. I don't want her to feel she has to choose. She calls me Dad, and that is enough for me. I just want her to know she is loved from every direction, even the direction she can't see. She doesn't need to know. It would only hurt her. He had been talking about me. He had been protecting me. He had been making sure I was loved by people I didn't even know existed, and he had done it silently, without wanting any credit for it, without wanting anything from me in return, except to go on calling him Dad and going to Christmas dinners and being his daughter in the ordinary dailiness of it. I sat with those letters for a long time. I am not going to tell you that I cried immediately, because I don't think I did. I think I went very still and very quiet, at the way you do when something rearranges the furniture of your entire interior life. I think I sat there and I read them a second time, and a third. And then I think I understood, really understood, for the first time in my adult life, what it is to be completely and absolutely wrong about a person you loved. The thing about carrying a wrong version of someone is that it protects you. I want to say that clearly because I think it is important, and I don't think people say it enough. The wrong version of my father that I built and maintained for 40 years gave me somewhere to put a feeling that I could not name. It gave me a reason for the distance, a justification for the coldness. If he was a man who deceived my mother, then I was a woman with principles and boundaries. If he was a man who had done nothing wrong, if he was in fact a man of extraordinary quiet goodness, then I was simply someone who had wasted 40 years being needlessly cold to her father, and that second version was unbearable. So I held on to the first one for as long as I could, which turned out to be until he was 3 years dead, and I was sitting in my spare bedroom with a bundle of letters in my hands. I have had a long time to think about what I would say to him if I could. I have had 30-some years since I found those letters, to sit with the knowledge of what I did and what it cost both of us. I have talked about it in the way that you talk about such things when you are very old, late at night, or early in the morning, in the place between sleep and waking, where honesty is easier. And what I want to say to him is not sorry, exactly though. I am sorry, deeply and permanently sorry. What I want to say is something more like, I see you now. I see who you actually were. I see the photographs you sent, and the string you tied around those envelopes, and the careful way you kept a dead man's sister connected to his daughter without making a fuss about it. I see it. I see all of it. I just see it too late. There is a particular kind of regret that does not feel like a sharp pain. It is not the regret of a single moment. a decision made in an instant that you can point to and say, there, that is where I went wrong. It is more like discovering that the path you thought you were walking all this time was actually a different path entirely, and that the view from where you are standing now is not at all what you thought it would be. That is what it feels like to be 87 and to understand, fully and without any remaining room for self-protection, that the story I told myself about my father was not his story at all. It was mine. I made it. I maintained it. And he went to his grave without ever knowing why his daughter had become so carefully distant, because I had been too proud or too frightened or too young, and then too habituated to simply walk into his study and say, Dad, I need to ask you something. Ask the questions. That is not a lesson. I am too old and too tired of lessons to offer you one of those. It is simply what I know. Ask the questions while the person is still in the room. Ask them when it is awkward and inconvenient, and when you are afraid of what the answer might be. Because the alternative is what I had, which is a bundle of letters in a cardboard box and a very long, very quiet kind of grief that has no clean end to it. My father's name was Ronald. Everyone called him Ron. He was a man who sent photographs of his stepdaughter to her dead father's family without telling anyone, without asking for anything, because he thought it was the right thing to do. He was a man I misunderstood for 40 years. He was a man who deserved better from me, and I loved him. I did love him. I just forgot to show him for a very long time. And by the tea, I remembered how, too, he was already gone.